Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little uncomfortable, but in a very slow, gentle way. The kind of uncomfortable that drifts in quietly, like a thought you didn't ask for, but also don't feel like arguing with. So before we get into it, take a moment, dim the lights a little, get comfortable wherever you are. And as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something oddly calming about realizing people all over the world are drifting off to the same strange stories. Tonight, we're not talking about the glory of medieval battles, not the shining armor, not the heroic charges. We're talking about what happened after. Because surviving a medieval battle didn't mean you were lucky. Not really. In fact, in many cases, it just meant your problems were about to become slower, much slower. So let's ease into it. Picture a battlefield, but not the dramatic version. No swelling music, no slow-motion heroics. Just mud, lots of mud. And bodies, some still moving, most not. The battle itself is over. Or at least, everyone has agreed, more or less, to stop hitting each other for the moment. And scattered across this landscape are the survivors. Now when we say survivors, it's important to understand what that actually meant. It didn't mean healthy, it didn't mean safe, it didn't even mean stable. It simply meant not dead yet. A man might be sitting upright, technically alive, while quietly holding in something that absolutely should not be outside his body. Another might be walking in slow circles, not entirely aware of where he is, or why everything suddenly sounds far away, and no one is rushing over with a clean medical kit and reassuring words. Because medieval battlefield medicine was not exactly known for its gentle bedside manner. Let's drift a little closer to one of these survivors. He's a foot soldier, nothing special. No noble title, no fancy armor. Just a guy who showed up when he was told to, probably with equipment he either borrowed or hoped wouldn't break too quickly. He survived the battle, which already puts him ahead of a significant percentage of his peers. But survival came at a cost. Maybe it's a deep cut along his thigh. Maybe it's a broken arm that never quite set properly. Or maybe it's something internal, something less visible, and far more dangerous. In the medieval world, wounds were unpredictable. Not because people didn't care, but because they didn't really understand what caused infections. They had theories, of course. Bad air, imbalanced humors, possibly divine displeasure, depending on the day. But the idea of invisible bacteria quietly turning a manageable wound into a life-threatening situation, that was not on the table. So our soldier, still breathing, is eventually carried or drags himself to what passes for a treatment area. This could be a tent, or a nearby building, or, in many cases, just a slightly less muddy patch of ground. And here's where things get gently unfortunate. Because treatment often involved methods that feel less like healing and more like enthusiastic guessing. A wound might be cleaned, or it might be cauterized with a hot piece of metal, which was about as pleasant as it sounds. Sometimes, substances like wine or vinegar were poured into wounds. Not entirely useless, but also not quite the miracle solution. And then there were amputations. Because if a limb looked too damaged, or showed signs of infection, the solution was often remove it, quickly, without anesthesia, because that wasn't really a thing yet. So survival, in this case, might mean waking up later and realizing that part of your body has quietly exited the situation. And if you're thinking, well, at least that saved him, the answer is maybe, because even after surviving the surgery, there was still the small matter of infection. Which brings us to one of the more consistent themes. You could survive the fight and still lose to what came after. Imagine our soldier a few days later. He's still alive, but he's not recovering in a peaceful, well-equipped hospital. He's likely in a crowded, unsanitary space, surrounded by others in similar or worse conditions. There's no real separation between injuries, no sterile environment, just people breathing, coughing, and trying not to think too far ahead. And ahead is where things get particularly uncertain. Because even if the wound doesn't immediately worsen, healing is slow. Painfully slow. Weeks, sometimes months. During that time, the body is doing its best with what it has, which often wasn't much. Nutrition could be poor. Clean water was not always guaranteed. And rest. Well, rest depended on whether anyone needed you to move again. And here's the part that tends to get overlooked. Let's say he does recover. Not perfectly, but enough to stand, to walk, to exist. What then? Because medieval societies didn't have structured support systems for injured veterans. There was no formal compensation. If you were lucky, you might return to your village, assuming it still existed, and assuming you could still contribute in some way. But if your injury limited your ability to work, things became complicated. A man who could no longer farm or fight suddenly found himself in a very fragile position. Family might help if they could, but charity had limits. And so, many survivors of battles quietly slipped into lives of poverty. Not dramatic, just gradual. Now, let's gently move to another kind of survivor. A knight, because of course, things were different for knights. They had better armor, better training, and ideally, better outcomes. But better is doing a lot of work here. Knights could afford more advanced medical attention, which often meant slightly more experienced surgeons, but the limitations were still there. No antibiotics, no real pain management, and a strong reliance on techniques that were creative. How many of these survivors were actually healed, not just physically, but mentally? While medieval texts don't often describe psychological trauma, the signs are there. Accounts of men becoming withdrawn, unpredictable, prone to sudden anger or deep silence. Sleep disturbances, nightmares. They wouldn't have called it that, but many were dealing with trauma. Let's drift a little further, away from the battlefield, into the long, quiet stretch of life that followed. Because this is where the reality truly settles in. A man who survived a battle might spend decades living with its consequences. Survival, in this context, isn't a single moment. It's an ongoing process. One that unfolds slowly, often without recognition. No medals, no grand acknowledgments, just continuing. For many medieval survivors, that was the real story. Not the clash of swords, but the long, quiet echo that followed. So as we let this settle, we'll gently move forward next time, into what happened when survival took an even stranger turn. Alright, let's just drift back in. No need to rush. Wherever you are, just settle a little deeper. Let your shoulders drop. We're continuing from that quiet, slightly uncomfortable place, where the battle is over, but nothing is really finished. Because survival, as we've seen, was not an ending. It was more like a doorway, and on the other side of that doorway, things could get a little strange. Not dramatic, not sudden, just slowly, quietly different. Let's ease into another kind of survivor. This one didn't go back to farming, didn't return to a trade, didn't quite fit back into the life he had before. Because sometimes the injuries weren't just physical. Or rather, they were physical, but in ways that changed everything. Imagine a man who survived with a severe facial wound. Not uncommon, unfortunately. Helmets helped, but they weren't perfect. And medieval weapons had a way of finding the gaps. So now, this man lives with a face that no longer looks the way people expect. And in a society that placed a quiet value on appearance, familiarity, and not being unsettling to look at. This mattered a lot. People might avoid eye contact. Children might stare. Some might whisper. Not loudly, just enough. And over time, this changes how a person moves through the world. He might start avoiding crowded places, speaking less, keeping his head slightly lowered, not out of shame exactly, but out of habit, because it's easier. And again, there's no structured support for this. No one is sitting him down to talk through what he's feeling. No one is offering guidance on how to rebuild a sense of self. There's just life, continuing. Now let's float over to another variation. A survivor who didn't just lose function, but gained a reputation. Because surviving a battle, especially in a visible, dramatic way, could sometimes turn a person into something like a living symbol. Not always a comfortable one, but a symbol nonetheless. Take, for example, a knight who survives multiple battles. He accumulates scars. Stories begin to follow him. People start to say things like, "He can't be killed," which, as it turns out, is usually an overstatement. But still, the idea sticks. And now, he's not just a person anymore. He's a narrative. A walking collection of exaggerated tales, which sounds impressive, until you realize it comes with expectations. Because once people believe you're unusually durable, they tend to expect you to keep proving it, again and again. And suddenly, survival becomes a kind of performance. You're expected to take risks, to show up in dangerous situations, to live up to the story that's been built around you. And if you don't, well, people notice. They might not say it directly, but there's a subtle shift, a quiet disappointment, as if you've somehow failed to be the myth they created for you. So even here, survival isn't restful, it's demanding. Now let's take a softer turn. Because not all transformations were about loss or pressure. Some were oddly peaceful. Occasionally, a survivor would simply decide not to go back, not to the battlefield, not to the expectations. Just step away. This wasn't the most common outcome, but it did happen. A man might return from a battle, sit quietly for a while, and then come to a very simple conclusion. I don't want to do that again. Which, honestly, feels like a reasonable takeaway. And so he might enter a monastery, or take up a quieter life, if he could. Because monasteries sometimes became places where former soldiers ended up. Not always out of deep spiritual calling, sometimes just because it was calmer, more predictable. Meals were regular, the environment was structured. And importantly, there was less risk of someone trying to hit you with a sword, which, after a while, starts to feel like a feature. So here we have a different kind of survivor. Not one defined by ongoing struggle, but one who quietly repositions himself, slows down, finds a rhythm that doesn't involve danger. And in a way, this might have been one of the more successful outcomes, though it came with its own adjustments. Because going from the chaos of battle to the stillness of monastic life is a shift, a big one. The silence alone could feel unfamiliar, almost too quiet, but over time, some adapted, and perhaps even found something like peace. Now let's gently shift again. Because there's another path, one that sits between survival and something less clearly defined. Captured survivors. Because not everyone who lived through a battle walked away freely. Many were taken, especially if they were valuable. Knights, in particular, could be ransomed, which sounds almost polite, but was still a very uncertain situation. A captured knight might be held for months, sometimes years, waiting for someone to gather enough resources to secure his release. During that time, conditions varied. Some were treated relatively well, others less so. But even in the best-case scenario, there was a quiet tension, a sense of being paused. Life not moving forward, but not ending either, just suspended. And that does something to a person. Time stretches differently, days blend together, and the question of what happens next becomes less urgent and more abstract. Because it depends on things entirely outside your control. Will the ransom come? Will it be enough? Will anyone remember? Eventually, some were released, and when they returned, they were different, not always visibly, but subtly, a bit quieter, a bit more measured, as if they had spent too long in a place where time didn't quite behave normally. Now let's drift towards something even quieter, the long-term survivors. The ones who lived decades after a battle, because these are the people who carried the full weight of what survival meant. Not in dramatic bursts, but in small, consistent ways. Every day, a knee that aches when it rains, a shoulder that never fully healed, a scar that pulls slightly when they move. Nothing urgent, nothing that demands attention. Just there, always. And over time, these things become part of identity. Not something separate, not something to fix, just part of the background of existence. And here's where things become almost gentle, because people adapt. They find ways to work around limitations, to adjust routines, to keep going, not in a heroic way, not in a way that gets recorded in history books, just quietly. And maybe that's the most consistent theme. That survival was not about dramatic comebacks. It wasn't about triumphant returns. It was about continuation, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes unexpected, sometimes oddly calm, but always ongoing. So as we let this part settle, we'll slowly move forward again, because there's still another layer to explore, one that involves not just the survivors themselves, but how the world around them responded. Because, as it turns out, people had opinions, subtle ones, about those who came back from battle, not quite the same. And those opinions could shape a survivor's life just as much as the battle itself. All right, let's settle back in again. No rush, just let the story find you where you are. By now, the battlefield feels a little further away. Not gone, just softened at the edges. And in its place, we have something quieter. A village, a town, a court, places where life continues, in its usual, steady rhythm. And into that rhythm, return the survivors. Not all at once, not in a grand procession, just gradually. A familiar face at the edge of a road. A figure walking a bit slower than before. Someone who used to laugh more, now speaking less. And the people who stayed behind notice. Of course they do. But medieval communities had an interesting way of dealing with change. They didn't always confront it directly. They observed it, adjusted around it, let it settle into place, like a new piece of furniture. So when a survivor returns, especially one who looks or behaves differently, there isn't usually a dramatic reaction. No gathering of concerned neighbors, just small shifts. A pause in conversation, a slightly longer glance. Then, life continues. Let's imagine one such return. A man walks back into his village after months away. He left as a relatively ordinary presence. Now he carries himself differently, not intentionally, but in the way he stands, in how he listens. There's a slight delay in his responses, as if part of him is still somewhere else, catching up. And the villagers notice, but they don't ask questions. Not because they don't care, but because asking questions could open something. And in a world where most people are already dealing with their own quiet difficulties, there's a kind of unspoken agreement. We won't dig too deeply. So instead, they welcome him back in the simplest ways. A nod, a brief greeting, a place at the table, if there's room. Because reintegration, in the medieval sense, wasn't about returning to who you were. It was about finding a way to exist as who you are now. And that process is uneven. Some days feel almost normal. Others don't. But life doesn't pause to accommodate that. There are fields to tend, tasks to complete, expectations, even if they're unspoken. So survivors adapt. Not perfectly, but steadily. In some cases, survivors, especially those with visible injuries, took on a kind of symbolic role, not quite honored, not quite pitied. They became reminders of war, of risk, of what happens when things go wrong. This could create a strange kind of distance, and that awareness changes the tone of interactions. Conversations might be shorter, more careful. Now let's float over to a more structured environment. A noble court, because things get a bit more complicated here. In a court, appearance matters, behavior matters. And a returning noble physically altered by battle introduces a challenge. Because courts thrive on presentation, on the careful arrangement of people, titles, and expectations. Let's imagine a nobleman returning with a visible injury. perhaps a missing hand. He still holds his title, still has his place. People might be more formal with him, more cautious in their tone. His presence now carries a kind of gravity. In some cases, visible survival could actually become an advantage. A scar could be interpreted as a sign of experience, of endurance. So a survivor might find that their presence commands a different kind of respect, quieter, more understated. But there. Now let's drift into something even more subtle. The role of memory, because communities remembered. This person went to war. This person came back. Over time, those simple facts become part of a person's identity. People might defer to them in certain situations, or avoid involving them in anything that feels too intense, out of instinct. Because there's a sense unspoken, but present, that this person has already carried enough. Now, let's ease into a different angle. Not all survivors returned to places that remembered them. Some came back to villages that had changed, or moved on. Or in some cases, didn't exist anymore. A survivor in this situation has to rebuild, find a new place, a new rhythm. And again, there's no guide for this. Now let's slow things down even further. There's one more layer, the internal shift. Something happening beneath all of that. A person who has survived carrying experience in a way that isn't always visible. It shows up in small habits, in how they react to sudden noises, in how they approach unfamiliar situations, not dramatically, just differently. So when we look at the broader picture, the reality of life after surviving a medieval battle isn't defined by a single outcome. It's a collection of subtle changes in the body, in the mind, in the way others respond. And all of these changes unfold slowly, quietly, without much documentation, but with a steady, persistent presence. So as we let this part settle, we'll continue drifting forward, because there's still another aspect to consider. Aging, because surviving a battle is one thing. Growing old after it is something else entirely. And the combination of the two creates a kind of story that's rarely told, but always there, just beneath the surface. Alright, let's drift a little further. No need to think too hard, just follow the slow current of it. We've moved away from the battlefield, away from the immediate return. And now we find ourselves in a much quieter place. Time has passed. Years, in fact. Our survivor is older now, not dramatically at first, just gradually. The kind of aging that happens without announcement. A few more lines on the face. A slower way of getting up in the morning. A longer pause before doing something that used to be simple. And through all of that, the battle is still there. Not loudly, not constantly, but present. Let's imagine him again. The same man who once stood in mud, surrounded by noise and confusion. Now he stands in a field. Or maybe sits near a doorway, watching the day move along at its usual pace. At first glance, nothing seems unusual. But if you look a little closer, you notice the way he shifts his weight, carefully, as if one side of his body doesn't quite agree with the other. Maybe it's an old injury in the leg. Something that healed, but not perfectly. And now, years later, it reminds him, especially when the weather changes. Cold mornings are the worst. The stiffness settles in quietly overnight. And when he wakes, there's a moment where he considers not moving. But of course he does. Because that's what survival has always required, continuation. So he gets up, slowly, adjusts to the familiar discomfort, and begins the day. Now here's something that often gets overlooked. In the medieval world, aging itself was already a challenge. Life expectancy wasn't particularly long. And for those who did reach older age, it often came with its own set of difficulties. Limited mobility, reduced strength. So when you combine that with the lingering effects of a battle injury, things become more complicated. A wound that was manageable in youth becomes restrictive in age. A limp turns into a defining feature of movement. And this shift doesn't happen all at once. It's slow, subtle, almost easy to ignore. Until it isn't. Let's take a quiet moment here. Because this part of the story doesn't involve major events. No battles, just time. And in that time, our survivor adapts again. He learns new ways to move, to work, to rest. Tasks that once took an hour now take 2, and that's fine. There's no urgency anymore. Or at least less of it. Now let's gently shift the focus. Because aging doesn't just affect the body, it changes perspective. The memories are still there, but they've softened, not disappeared. Just settled, like dust on a surface. He might still remember the sounds, the confusion, the moments that didn't quite make sense. But they don't arrive as sharply. They come in fragments, small pieces, a sound, a smell, a brief image, and then they pass. Storytelling, because as survivors age, they sometimes begin to tell their stories, not in grand speeches, just casually, to a younger person who asks, or during a quiet evening when there's not much else to do. And these stories are interesting. A survivor might describe a battle focusing on small details, what the ground felt like, how heavy the armor was, skipping over the more intense parts entirely, not intentionally, just naturally, because the mind organizes things in its own way. The act of telling these stories isn't just about sharing information, it's about making sense of things. Even years later, aging survivors often occupy a different place in their communities. They become observers, sources of memory, a recognition that this person has lived through more than most, and is still here, still present, still part of the rhythm of daily life. Now let's take a softer angle. Because not all aging survivors lived in comfort. Many still faced hardship, limited resources, and yet they continued. Because that's what they had always done, from the battlefield to the long years after. We're approaching one of the quietest parts of this entire story. The idea of looking back. An older survivor, sitting somewhere familiar, watching the day unfold. And in those quiet moments, there's space for reflection. A recognition of what has been lived, what has been endured, and what remains. Just a sense of continuity. The final one. What happened when survival reached its natural end? Not in battle, not in crisis, but in the quiet, ordinary way. Because even there, the echoes of that long ago moment remained, subtle, persistent, and in their own way, defining. All right, let's settle in one last time. No need to shift too much. Just get comfortable in whatever way feels easiest. We've followed this path a long way now, from the battlefield, to the slow return, to the long stretch of years afterward. And now we arrive at something very simple. The ending, not dramatic, not sudden, just the natural close of a life. Because for most survivors of medieval battles, death did not come in the clash of swords. It came later. Much later, if they were fortunate. And when it did, it often looked very ordinary. A bed, a room, familiar surroundings, perhaps family nearby. Or perhaps just a quiet space with no one paying particular attention at the exact moment it happened. Because in the medieval world, death was common, not ignored, but not treated as something extraordinary every time. It was part of the rhythm, expected, accepted, and for someone who had survived something as chaotic as a battle, there's a quiet contrast here. The beginning of their second life was loud, uncertain, filled with confusion. The end is often the opposite, still, predictable, almost gentle. Let's imagine our survivor again, older now. Much older than he ever expected to be, perhaps. Sitting or lying in a place that feels familiar. There's no urgency. No sense of something needing to be done. Just a gradual slowing. And in that slowing, there might be moments of awareness. Not constant, just passing thoughts. Memories that come and go, not in order, not as a clear story, but in fragments, a field. A sound, a face that no longer has a name attached to it. And somewhere among those fragments, the battle, still there. Not dominant, but present, as it has been, in some form, all along. Now here's something interesting. By the time a survivor reaches this stage of life, the battle itself is no longer the central event. It's one part of a much longer sequence. Important, yes, but surrounded by years of other experiences, work, conversations, small, ordinary moments. And this changes how it exists in memory. It's no longer the thing that defined everything. It's something that happened. Something that shaped certain paths, but not the whole story. And that shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just becomes true over time. Now let's gently widen the view. Because when a survivor passes, something else begins. Not for them, but for the people around them. Memory. Because medieval communities didn't preserve detailed personal histories in the way we might expect. There were no recordings, no written memoirs for most people. Just stories, fragments, shared in conversation. This person fought in a battle once. He came back with that injury. He lived a long time after. Simple statements. But over time, even those begin to soften. Details fade. Specifics blur. And what remains is a kind of general impression. A sense that this person lived through something difficult. And continued. And then, eventually, stopped. Not abruptly. Just naturally. Now let's drift into something even quieter. Because there's a kind of stillness that follows all of this. A life that once contained so much movement, so much adaptation, so much quiet endurance, comes to rest. And the world continues. Fields are still worked. Conversations still happen. Other people are born, live, and move through their own versions of events. And in that ongoing flow, the individual story dissolves gently into the background. Not erased, just absorbed. Now here's where things become almost reflective. Because when we look at the full arc of life after surviving a medieval battle, it doesn't follow the pattern we might expect. There's no clear triumph, no moment where everything is resolved. Instead, it's a series of small adjustments, a long chain of continuation, from injury to recovery, to adaptation, to aging, to ending, each stage blending into the next, without sharp edges, without dramatic transitions. And maybe that's the most important part. Because survival in this context wasn't about overcoming and then moving on completely. It was about carrying something forward. Not all at once, not all the time, just in pieces. And those pieces became part of everyday life, part of identity, part of how a person existed in the world. Now let's take one final gentle look back at the battlefield. Not as it was in the moment, but as it exists in memory. Distant, quiet, almost unreal, and scattered across it. The idea of survival, not as a single event, but as the beginning of a long, slow process, one that unfolded over years, decades, even, in ways that were rarely recorded, rarely noticed, but always present. And so, when we think about the lucky ones who survived, it helps to adjust the definition a little. They were lucky, in that they continued. But that continuation came with its own shape, its own rhythm, its own quiet demands. And they met those demands day after day, not dramatically, not heroically, just steadily, until eventually there was no more to continue. And that was enough. So as we let this story come to rest, there's nothing more to resolve, no final twist, no closing revelation. Just the gentle understanding that survival in the medieval world was not an ending. It was a beginning, a slow one, a quiet one, and in its own way, a very long journey. All right, that's where we'll leave it tonight. Wherever you are, I hope you're a little more relaxed than when we started, and as always, rest well. So imagine waking up one morning in a drafty medieval town, stretching a bit, maybe thinking about bread. And then someone knocks on your door to inform you that you are now legally required to fight another human being to prove your innocence. Not debate, not explain, not bring a witness. Fight to the possible death. Because, of course, this seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Trial by combat was the medieval world's way of saying, we're not entirely sure who's telling the truth, so let's just let God sort it out. And by God sorting it out, they meant two people hitting each other with sticks or swords until one of them stopped moving convincingly. It sounds dramatic in a history book, but for the people living through it, it was less heroic duel and more deeply inconvenient life interruption. Most people dragged into these fights were not knights. They were bakers, farmers, slightly confused peasants who had maybe thrown a punch once. Let's drift into one of these lives. Picture a man named Thomas. Thomas lives in a small village. He has a cow. The cow is his entire personality. Life is stable. Then one day, his neighbor accuses him of theft. Maybe a tool or a sack of grain. Thomas insists he is innocent. He gestures. He probably brings up the cow as a character reference. But evidence is thin. The local authority, tired and wanting lunch, declares the matter will be settled by trial by combat. Thomas is now expected to fight. He cannot really say no. Refusing was often taken as an admission of guilt. So Thomas nods, wondering how things escalated so quickly. Not everyone fought personally. If you were wealthy or clever, you could hire a champion. Think of it as outsourcing your survival. Thomas, unfortunately, cannot afford a champion. So he prepares. And medieval preparation is less about training montages and more about quiet panic. The day arrives. The combat takes place in a designated area. There are rules, surprisingly many rules. For example, both fighters had to use the same type of weapon. If one had a sword, the other got a sword. Thomas steps into the field. Across from him stands his accuser, the opponent, who, inconveniently, looks much stronger. There's a quiet moment, and then they begin. Despite everything, not all these fights ended in death. Many ended in exhaustion. If you lost, if you yielded, or were defeated, you were considered guilty. Because God, apparently, had made his decision through your inability to win. It is a system that places an extraordinary amount of faith in divine intervention, and a suspiciously large amount of emphasis on upper body strength. Let's float over to another version. Trial by combat appeared in higher circles too. In noble courts, accusations could be more elaborate. Imagine a noble woman selecting a professional fighter to represent her. Across from him stands another champion representing the accuser. For them, this was a profession. And yet, the underlying belief remained. God would decide, through them. Victory meant truth. Defeat meant guilt. It begins to feel less like justice and more like a very structured coin toss, except the coin had a sword. Some saw them for what they were, a legal mechanism that could be influenced. If you could afford a better champion, your chances improved. Back to Thomas. The ones who did not choose this system but had to live within it. For them, trial by combat was a terrifying disruption. And afterward, life continued, if they survived. They went back to their fields, their homes, their cows, perhaps with a few more scars. They would find themselves standing in a field, holding a weapon, hoping quietly, tiredly that things would somehow work out. Because, of course, if you're not sure who's right, why not just have them fight it out? Let's drift a little further into this strange system, where justice feels less like a careful weighing of facts and more like an oddly organized sporting event. Except the stakes are your reputation, your property, and occasionally your continued existence. Now, earlier we brushed against the idea of champions. Those professional fighters who stepped in so that other people didn't have to risk being immediately flattened. In a field somewhere behind a church. And honestly, if you had the option, you took it, because fighting personally was not ideal. So let's settle into the life of one of these champions. Not a legendary knight with banners and songs, but a working man, a professional. Someone whose job description was essentially, fight strangers to resolve legal disputes. We'll call him Martin. Martin wakes up early, not because he is particularly motivated, but because his work requires it. Training, after all, is important when your career involves being hit with objects. He lives in a town large enough to support this kind of work. There are enough disputes, enough accusations, enough slightly irritated nobles. Martin is not noble. He is not especially wealthy. But he has a skill set that is, oddly enough, in demand. He knows how to fight. More importantly, he knows how to win. Which, in this line of work, is the same thing. People come to him with their problems. Not emotional problems. Not philosophical ones. Very specific, very physical problems. I've been accused of something. I need someone to fight for me. Martin listens, nods, possibly asks a few practical questions like, what weapons are allowed? Or, do they have a champion already? Because these details matter a great deal more than whether his client is actually innocent. And that's the quiet part everyone sort of sidesteps. Martin does not investigate the truth. He does not gather evidence. He is not particularly concerned with whether his client stole the thing, insulted the person, or trespassed on the land. His role is simple. Win the fight. Because winning the fight defines the truth. It's a very efficient system, in a slightly unsettling way. Now, before a trial by combat, there were often formal agreements. Contracts, in a sense. Terms laid out clearly so that both sides understood. Weapons were specified. Sometimes swords, sometimes clubs. Occasionally more specialized tools, depending on local customs. There were also rules about the space. The boundaries. Stepping outside them could mean forfeiting. Even the timing could be regulated. Sunrise to sunset, because apparently, divine judgment operated on a schedule. Martin prepares carefully. He checks his equipment. He stretches in a very medieval way, which is to say, probably not very effectively. He eats something light. No one wants to go into a legal duel feeling sluggish. And then he meets his client. This is often the most quietly awkward part, because the client is usually nervous, deeply nervous. They might try to explain their innocence. They might say things like, I swear, I didn't do it. Martin nods politely. Of course you didn't. Everyone says that. And it doesn't really matter. What matters is that, in a few hours, he will be standing across from another man. Two professionals, two truths, one outcome. Let's gently move into one of these fights. The field is prepared. People gather, but not in the loud, cheering way you might expect. This is not entertainment, exactly. It is official. There are officials present, observers, people whose job it is to ensure that the rules are followed. Martin steps into the space. Across from him is another champion. We'll call him Hugo. Hugo looks experienced, which is never comforting. There is a brief moment where they acknowledge each other, not with friendliness, more like a quiet recognition of shared profession. Yes, this again, the signal is given. And they begin. Now, unlike Thomas from earlier, this is not chaotic flailing. This is measured, controlled, almost calm in a strange way. They circle, they watch, they wait. Because rushing in blindly is how you lose. And losing, in this context, is not just a bad day at work. It is a very definitive statement about someone else's guilt. Martin attacks first. A careful strike. Hugo blocks. Counters. They move. Time stretches, minutes feel longer. Movements become slower, more deliberate. These fights could last a very long time. It wasn't just about strength. It was about patience, about not making mistakes. Because one mistake could be enough. Eventually, something shifts. It always does. Maybe Hugo slips slightly. Maybe Martin sees an opening. And then, a hit lands, Hugo stumbles. And in that moment, the balance tips. Martin presses forward, carefully, methodically. And then, at some point, Hugo yields, because continuing would be unwise. The officials step in. The fight ends. Martin's client is declared innocent. Hugo's client is declared guilty. Not because of new evidence, but because one man was slightly better at fighting. And everyone accepts this. The system is seen as legitimate, because the outcome has been interpreted through a lens of divine will. Now let's slow down and look at what happens after. Martin is paid. Hopefully, payment disputes were ironically not uncommon. He goes home, rests, prepares for the next case. Because there will always be another case, another accusation. If the clients lose, consequences follow. Fines, loss of property, social standing. Because losing the fight is losing the truth. Sometimes the participants were mismatched. There are recorded cases where a man and a woman were involved in a trial by combat. The man would be placed in a pit, literally, a hole in the ground, often up to his waist, restricting his movement. The woman would be given a weapon, sometimes a stone wrapped in cloth, something she could swing. The idea was to balance the physical differences, which is both oddly creative and deeply strange. Imagine being that man, standing in a pit, looking up, or the woman, trying to process that her innocence will be determined by how she uses a stone. As we continue to drift, trial by combat was not about glory. It was about individuals navigating a world where justice and ability were intertwined. A world where truth could be shaped by strength, endurance, and a bit of luck. And for the people caught inside it, it was just something that happened, so they could return quietly to whatever version of normal they had before someone decided that a fight was the best way to solve a problem. Let's float a little further into this world, where legal systems occasionally looked at a complicated human problem and responded with, yes, but what if we added a pit? Because as strange as the standard duels were, some of the more unusual versions of trial by combat had a certain creative flair. Not necessarily helpful, not necessarily fair, but definitely creative. Now, earlier we touched on the scenario where a man and a woman might face each other in a legal duel. But instead of canceling the idea, medieval authorities adjusted the format. The man would stand in a pit, usually waist-deep, sometimes with one hand tied. The woman, meanwhile, would stand above ground, free to move, armed with a weighted cloth or a small club. It's the kind of setup that suggests someone spent a decent amount of time thinking, how do we make this fair? And then confidently arrived at this. Agnes did not wake up expecting to participate in a legal duel. She likely had plans. Bread-related plans, perhaps. But an accusation has been made. Something serious enough to require resolution, but not clear enough to resolve through witnesses. She stands at the edge of the field, holding a length of cloth with a stone tied at the end. It's heavier than she expected. Across from her, in a pit, stands a man we'll call Peter. Peter looks uncomfortable. There's a quiet moment between them, not hostile, not dramatic. Just two people aware that this situation has become slightly ridiculous. The officials explain the rules, carefully, as if explaining them clearly will somehow make the whole thing feel more reasonable. And then, because medieval systems rarely second-guess themselves, the fight begins. Now this is not a fast exchange. It can't be. Peter is restricted, his movement limited. Agnes circles, slowly, carefully, trying to figure out how to approach this without immediately putting herself at risk. Agnes swings, not very effectively at first. The cloth weapon arcs awkwardly through the air. Peter blocks, using what little mobility he has. Over time, Agnes becomes more confident. The swings become more controlled, more deliberate. Peter, meanwhile, grows tired. Standing in one place, constantly defending, is exhausting in its own quiet way. And eventually something gives. It always does. It ends. Not dramatically. Just a moment where one person can no longer continue. Agnes is either vindicated or condemned. Peter, likewise. all based on this carefully structured, deeply peculiar encounter. Now let's drift gently away from the field and into the aftermath. What happens after these fights is often quieter than you might expect. For all its strangeness, trial by combat was woven into everyday life in a way that made it feel almost routine. Does strength really equal truth? Does winning a fight actually prove innocence? Let's gently move toward another type of participant. Not the reluctant peasant, but the noble. So we'll call him Lord Henry. Henry is not untrained. He has experience with weapons and high-born pride. He stands in the field, dressed more carefully than necessary, because appearance still matters, even here. When they strike, it is controlled, intentional, not wild, because losing here is not just losing a case. It is losing face. Trial by combat was not a single uniform experience. It changed depending on who you were. And as we move forward, we'll begin to see what happens when that belief starts to quietly unravel. Let's drift onward, gently, into a period where people were still very committed to trial by combat, but also, in a quiet and slightly awkward way, beginning to notice that it might not be the most reliable system ever created. Not in a loud, revolutionary sense. No one is standing in the middle of a town square shouting, "This is absurd." It's more subtle than that. More like a collective, slow realization that occasionally surfaces in the form of raised eyebrows and hesitant comments. Because systems like this don't disappear overnight. They linger. They settle into habits. They become familiar. Now, to understand this shift, we need to settle into the life of someone who exists right at the edge of this change. We'll call him Elias. Elias is not a fighter. He's the kind of person who prefers paperwork, quietly, consistently. He deals in records, agreements, and land boundaries. Things that do not usually involve being hit with a stick. He works in a small administrative role. Not important enough to make decisions, but important enough to witness them. Which means he has seen trial by combat more than once. Not as a participant, as an observer. And observing something repeatedly has a way of changing how you feel about it. At first, Elias accepted it like everyone else. Of course, disputes are settled this way. Of course, God reveals the truth through combat. Of course, this is normal. But over time, small details begin to stand out. Patterns, inconsistencies, the kind of things that don't quite fit the narrative. For example, he notices that the same champions tend to win, not always, but often enough to feel noticeable. Which raises a quiet question. Are they winning because their clients are telling the truth, or because they are simply better at fighting? It's not a loud question. Elias doesn't announce it, he just thinks it, and then he notices something else. Wealthier individuals tend to have better outcomes. They can afford experienced champions, skilled fighters. Meanwhile, poorer individuals are often left to fend for themselves, which introduces a subtle imbalance. Elias doesn't confront anyone. He simply writes things down, keeps records, observes, because that is what he does. Now let's move into a specific case that Elias witnesses. A dispute between two men over land. One man, Jacob, is older. Not weak, but not in his prime. He has worked the land for years. The other, Otto, is younger, stronger, more physically capable. Neither can afford a champion. So they will fight themselves. Elias watches as they prepare. He notes the difference immediately. Otto moves with confidence. Jacob looks thoughtful. The field is marked. The rules are explained. And the fight begins. Otto is faster, stronger. Jacob defends carefully, trying to conserve energy. For a while, it balances out. But over time, the difference becomes apparent. Otto presses forward. Jacob tires. Eventually, Jacob falls. Not dramatically. Just a gradual loss of momentum until he can no longer continue. Otto is declared the rightful owner. Elias writes this down, but this time something lingers. The outcome feels less like a revelation of truth and more like a confirmation of physical ability. Jacob may have been correct, The fight did not clarify that. It only demonstrated who could outlast the other. And this, slowly, quietly, begins to matter. Across different regions and towns, similar thoughts begin to surface. Judges start to notice inconsistencies. Clergy members begin to question whether every outcome truly reflects divine will. Instead of abandoning trial by combat entirely, some places begin to adjust. They introduce alternatives. More emphasis on witness testimony, on documents. On oaths, trial by combat becomes slightly less dominant. Elias notices this too. Fewer cases. Occasional moments where a dispute is resolved without anyone picking up a weapon. Still, the old system lingers, because habits are difficult to break. Tradition carries weight. Let's return to the individuals. People like Jacob, who after losing, must now adjust to the consequences. He returns home, perhaps to less land than before, and that is that. Otto, meanwhile, gains land and status. Even if there is a small awareness that the outcome was shaped by more than just truth. As we continue drifting forward, the pattern becomes clearer. Trial by combat is not disappearing. Not yet, but it is changing. Because sometimes, the most significant changes are not the loud ones. They are the quiet ones that unfold gradually, over time. Let's drift a little further forward, into that soft, in-between period where trial by combat still exists but feels slightly out of place. Not gone, not forgotten, just lingering. Like a habit people haven't quite broken yet, even though they've already started replacing it with something else. Because by this point, quieter methods are gaining ground. Written records are taken more seriously. Witnesses are listened to with a bit more patience. Judges are beginning to rely on reasoning rather than swinging objects. And yet, every now and then, someone still says, "No, I want a trial by combat." And the system, being what it is, sighs internally and replies, "Fine." So let's settle into one of these later cases. We'll call the man requesting it Roland. Roland is in many ways a product of an earlier mindset. Not old, exactly, but raised on stories where honor is defended physically, where disputes are settled directly, where stepping into a field feels appropriate. He has been accused of fraud. A financial matter, numbers, agreements, promises. The kind of issue that is handled with documents, but Roland doesn't trust that. Or perhaps he believes that a fight will work in his favor. Roland is strong, confident, and comfortable with confrontation. The court hesitates, not dramatically, just a pause. A slight shift in tone, because this is no longer the default option. So after some consideration, they allow it. Roland's opponent, let's call him Matthias, is less enthusiastic. Matthias would prefer almost anything else. Paperwork, witnesses, a long dull discussion about numbers. But refusing the challenge would reflect poorly on him. And so, reluctantly, he agrees. Now here's where things feel different. The preparation is less formal. Not sloppy, but not as ritualized as before. There are still rules, still boundaries. But the sense of inevitability is gone. This is how things used to be done. Roland steps into the field with confidence. Matthias steps in with resignation. The officials watch, their expressions detached. The fight begins. Roland moves aggressively, quickly. He wants to end it fast, to prove his point. Matthias defends awkwardly at first. He is not comfortable here. But something interesting happens. Matthias adapts. Time passes. Roland's initial advantage begins to fade slightly. Sustaining that level of intensity is difficult. And slowly, the fight evens out. This uncertainty feels different. In earlier times, uncertainty would be resolved through belief. But now, that belief is less absolute. Observers watch with a different perspective. Not just who will win, but what does this prove? Roland lands a strike. Matthias stumbles, but he recovers. It becomes clear that this is not a revelation of truth. It is a contest of endurance, of luck, of small decisions made under pressure. And eventually, as always, it ends. Let's say Roland wins. He stands victorious. The officials step forward. They declare the outcome. Roland is, by this measure, innocent. But the reaction is muted. No one seems entirely convinced. They've seen enough of these fights to understand their limitations. Roland returns home, technically vindicated. But something feels off. Victory does not feel as definitive as it once did. Across regions, similar cases unfold. Trial by combat is used less frequently. It feels out of sync with the rest of the system. Judges prefer other methods. Clergy lean toward interpretation. Communities grow more comfortable with evidence. And slowly, the reliance on combat fades. Through the quiet realization that other methods work just as well or better. No grand announcement, just fewer fights, fewer fields marked out. Life becomes a little more predictable, a little more grounded. Disputes are still unpleasant, but the solutions shift toward words and records, toward something less dependent on who can swing harder. And yet, trial by combat leaves a trace. A memory of a time when truth was something you could, in theory, fight for. As we drift forward, we'll see how that memory lingers, even if the rest of the world has started to quietly disagree. By the time trial by combat reaches its final stretch of existence, it doesn't really announce itself as ending. There's no dramatic "this is the last one ever" moment. No ceremonial closing chapter. No official historical note where everyone stops, puts down their weapons, and agrees that maybe this was a strange way to run a justice system. It just fades, slowly, unevenly, like a tradition that keeps forgetting to show up, until eventually nobody bothers to wait for it anymore. And in those last phases, the fights that still happen feel different, not because the rules have changed, but because the world around them has. Let's settle into one of these late-stage cases. We'll call him Gerard. Gerard is accused of a property dispute. Again, at this point, it's almost always property. Land boundaries, contracts, debts. Things that used to escalate into combat, but are now usually handled with paperwork, witnesses, and a long sigh from whoever is in charge. But Gerard insists on trial by combat. Not because it is required, but because it is still technically allowed. And more importantly, because he believes it will help him. That belief is important. Because by now, belief is almost the only thing keeping the practice alive. The court doesn't encourage it. They don't discourage it either. They simply allow it with the tired energy of people watching an outdated system. And so it is arranged. A field is marked. Rules are read. Observers arrive, though fewer than before. Less enthusiasm. More obligation. And Gerard steps into the space. Across from him is his opponent, someone who, under newer systems, might never have been here at all. Someone who would have resolved this through testimony, or documentation, or mediation. But instead, here they are, standing in a field. Because history is not always tidy in how it exits. The fight begins. And almost immediately, something is noticeable. Not in the fighters themselves, but in the atmosphere. There is less tension than before. Less expectation that this moment will reveal something profound. People are watching, but not with the old sense of certainty. It feels procedural. Gerard attacks, his opponent defends. They move through the motions. But there is a subtle absence of belief behind it all. Like everyone present is participating in something they already suspect is symbolic rather than meaningful. Time passes. Blows are exchanged. But instead of feeling like truth emerging through struggle, it feels like two people trying to complete an outdated task correctly. And eventually, as always, it ends. A decision is made. One side is declared victorious. The other is not. But the reaction is muted. Because even if the system still produces outcomes, fewer people trust what those outcomes mean. Gerard stands there afterward, breathing heavily, expecting something: certainty, perhaps, validation. But what he gets instead is quiet acknowledgement, not disbelief, not acceptance. Just a kind of neutral closure. As if the matter has been resolved administratively, not divinely. And that is the shift that defines the end of trial by combat more than anything else. Not the disappearance of the fights, but the disappearance of the certainty behind them. Now let's drift away from Gerard and look at the broader world one last time. Because by this point, trial by combat is no longer a central tool. It exists in fragments, in isolated regions, in exceptional cases, in legal echoes of older systems that no longer feel necessary. The legal world has moved on in practical terms. Evidence matters more. Reasoning matters more. Systems of judgment have become more structured, more analytical, less dependent on physical confrontation. And slowly, the idea that truth can be determined by combat starts to feel outdated, not evil, not ridiculous, just no longer useful. And that is often how practices end. Not in rejection, but in replacement. Something better or at least more reliable takes its place. Still, trial by combat doesn't vanish from memory. It stays in stories, in records, in legal history texts. People look back and think, they really did that. Yes, they did, for centuries. Because in its time, it made sense within its worldview. A world where divine justice was expected to manifest physically, where strength and fate were intertwined, where uncertainty could be resolved through action rather than analysis. And for the individuals who lived through it, it was not abstract. It was personal. It was immediate. It was standing in a field holding a weapon, hoping that whatever larger force governed the world would recognize your position. Some won, some lost, some barely survived it. And all of them returned to lives that continued afterward, carrying the weight of whatever outcome had been decided for them. So when we look back at trial by combat now, it's easy to treat it as strange. And it is strange. But it is also deeply human in a way that older systems often are. A desire for certainty, a desire for closure, a desire to resolve disagreement in a way that feels final, even if the method for doing so was questionable at best. And as the practice fades out of use, it leaves behind a quiet lesson that doesn't get written into laws, but lingers anyway. That not every truth needs to be proven through force. That not every disagreement needs a winner and a loser. And that sometimes, the most stable systems are the ones that replace combat with something far less dramatic. Conversation, evidence, time. So in the end, trial by combat doesn't end with a bang. It ends with a slow, unremarkable shift in how people choose to decide things. And somewhere in that shift, the world quietly agrees that maybe letting two people fight it out was never the clearest way to understand what was true. Even if, for a very long time, it was the only way they knew how. So at some point in history, usually right after someone handed you a spear, a shield, and a very unconvincing explanation of why you should be excited about it, there was always a small group of people who quietly thought, actually, no, and then they left. Which, depending on the era, was either a mildly inconvenient personal choice, or a crime punishable by very creative forms of public discouragement. Desertion sounds dramatic when you say it now. Like a cinematic moment. A soldier throwing down his armor, walking into the sunset, leaving behind duty and destiny. In reality, most of it was not cinematic at all. It was cold, wet, confusing, and usually involved a man realizing that the army he joined was not going to let him go home anytime soon, if ever. Let's start gently with the Roman world, because of course we do. Rome had opinions about everything, but especially about leaving the army without permission. The Roman army was not built on casual attendance. Once you were in, you were in. For a long time. And the Romans, being the Romans, had a very structured way of dealing with people who decided they were done. A deserter was not just someone who left. He was someone who disrupted the order of the universe. The punishment varied, but it often involved a public lesson in consequences. Because Rome loved a public lesson. But before we get to punishments, it's worth slowing down and actually looking at why someone would desert in the first place. Because most of the time, it wasn't ideology. It wasn't rebellion. It was tiredness, fear. Imagine a young Rahman recruit. Let's call him Marcus because that feels correct. Marcus probably signed up because someone told him it would bring honor, or pay, or land. Instead, he gets mud. A lot of mud, and marching. Endless marching. At some point, Marcus begins to notice something important. Home is not getting closer. So one night, under a sky that is doing nothing to help morale, Marcus makes a decision. He just doesn't come back from a short errand, and keeps not coming back. Because armies are large, organized systems, and leaving one quietly is not as easy as stepping away from a bad conversation. So Marcus becomes something else. A problem, a missing name, a gap in a formation. Let's float forward in time a bit, because desertion does not belong to one empire. It belongs to all armies. Medieval Europe handled it with its usual blend of practicality and theatrical punishment. Feudal armies were raised through obligation. Lords called men to serve, villages contributed fighters. Now imagine a medieval soldier. Let's call him William. William is not a professional soldier. At first, it is manageable. Marching, waiting, boredom, food becomes uncertain, pay becomes theoretical. William starts to think, which is always the beginning of trouble in these stories. At first, he thinks small thoughts. I miss home. This is unpleasant. Why is everything damp? Then the thoughts get slightly larger. What if I just left? Because leaving was not just disobedience. It was betrayal. Of your lord. Of your obligation. So William does what many deserters did. He waits for an opportunity, and then he disappears. If William is lucky, he makes it home and blends back into village life, pretending he was never gone. Because armies could not simply ignore desertion. If they did, everyone would leave, and then there would be no army. Let's drift again into a later period. Early modern armies, mercenaries, professional soldiers. Records are kept. Punishments are standardized. Legal frameworks exist specifically to manage desertion. And yet, people still leave. Because structure does not remove fatigue or fear. Now imagine a soldier in a 17th century army. We'll call him Johann. One night, Johann looks at the camp. He looks at the guards. He looks at the dark edges of the forest nearby. And he makes a calculation, not a heroic one, a practical one. So he leaves. And now Johann becomes part of a much larger pattern. Because armies across Europe are dealing with this constantly. Men leaving, men disappearing. Some are caught. Some are not. Some return voluntarily. And some simply vanish into civilian life. And through all of this, something interesting begins to emerge. Armies slowly adapt. Discipline becomes more formalized. Pay becomes more reliable. Incentives are adjusted. Because here is the quiet truth behind desertion. Punishment alone is not enough, as we see desertion not just as a crime, but as feedback, unintentional, uncoordinated, but very consistent. And in the next part, we'll drift into what happens when armies begin to respond to that feedback more deliberately. So as armies get larger, more organized, and slightly more aware that people don't actually enjoy indefinite suffering, desertion stops being this scattered, almost casual phenomenon and starts becoming something closer to a system-level headache. Because now you don't just have a guy who wandered off. You have patterns. You have timing. You have entire units quietly deciding, sometimes at the same moment, that they are no longer emotionally invested in the current military campaign. And from the commander's perspective, this is deeply inconvenient. From the soldier's perspective, it is still deeply inconvenient, just in a different direction. Let's drift into a slightly more structured army now. Think early modern Europe, uniforms, drums, orders that arrive in very loud, very official ways. Soldiers are now part of standing armies more often than feudal levies, which means they are paid professionals. In theory, this should reduce desertion. In theory, because if you are being paid, you are less likely to leave, right? Well, yes, and also no. Because now desertion becomes less about obligation and more about economics. And economics, unfortunately, is not always stable. Let's meet someone here. We'll call him Pierre. Pierre's a soldier in a large, expanding army. He is technically professional, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly means he is expected to show up consistently. He is underpaid, underfed, and occasionally marched across continents for reasons that are explained very vaguely. Pierre's relationship with his army is transactional, in theory. He provides service. They provide money. In practice, the money part is often delayed, or described as coming soon, which is one of history's more flexible promises. At first, Pierre stays, because staying is what soldiers do, and also because leaving is risky. Armies are not fond of it, but over time, something shifts. The march is long. The food is worse than expected. The pay, again, is inconsistent. And the campaign itself begins to feel less like a noble cause, and more like a slow-moving administrative misunderstanding. Pierre starts noticing something very specific. Locals are living their lives. Villages are still functioning. People are still farming, trading, arguing about small things that do not involve marching information for weeks at a time. And that contrast begins to sit in his mind in a way that is not entirely helpful for military discipline. Because once you realize there is an alternative existence happening parallel to your own, the appeal of that alternative starts to grow. Now, desertion in this era is not just walking away into the forest and hoping no one notices. Armies are bigger, better tracked, more bureaucratic. So leaving requires planning, timing, a certain willingness to gamble on not being caught. Pierre observes guard rotations. He notes supply movements. He notes which soldiers seem more likely to complain loudly and notice less. And he waits. Because desertion is no longer just emotional, it is logistical. One night, during a march stop, Pierre makes his move. Not dramatically, not with a speech. Just stepping away from where he is supposed to be. Now, what's interesting here is not just the act itself. It's what it implies. Because armies at this point are beginning to understand something. People don't just desert randomly. They desert when conditions reach a certain threshold. Poor pay, bad leadership, harsh conditions, low morale. And once that threshold is crossed often enough, desertion stops being an individual failure and becomes a collective symptom. Commanders respond by tightening discipline, stricter punishments, more surveillance, more rules. But here's the thing. That doesn't always solve the underlying issue. It just makes leaving harder. If conditions are bad enough to make people want to leave, and leaving is made impossible, you haven't solved the problem. You've just contained it. Let's drift a little further. Because desertion also has geography. Borderlands, long campaigns, poorly supplied armies create these environments. Commanders start planning around it. They assume a certain percentage of men will leave. They adjust strategies accordingly. Now let's look at what happens when deserters are caught. Because armies cannot simply ignore them. In later systems, it becomes more formalized. Courts-martial, procedures, structured penalties. The goal remains the same, to make leaving seem less appealing than staying. Of course, this only works up to a point. Now let's gently move into something a bit more human. Fear, not ideological fear. Just the experience of warfare itself. Let's meet someone here. We'll call him Andre. Andre is in a battle-heavy campaign. Each engagement leaves a small mark. Not always physical, sometimes psychological. One day, between battles, Andre stops feeling like a participant in a system and starts feeling like someone moving between dangerous moments. One morning, Andre simply does not return to formation. He does not announce it. He just leaves and disappears into a landscape that is large enough to allow disappearance. Because when something becomes persistent enough, systems adapt. Recruitment changes, pay structures improve, armies become more professional. But for the soldiers themselves, the experience remains fundamentally the same. They are still human beings placed into structured violence. Even the most disciplined structures in history are still built out of people. And people, given enough pressure, will eventually look for a way out. Which brings us to the final layer. Armies hold together through a fragile balance of necessity, survival, and the belief that staying is better than leaving. And once that belief weakens, desertion stops being an exception and becomes a signal, one that history repeats across time. By now, armies have had centuries to figure out a very simple problem. People don't like being soldiers all the time. And yet, somehow this continues to surprise them. So the systems get more sophisticated. Roll calls, muster points, records that are checked and rechecked with a kind of seriousness usually reserved for financial audits or royal scandals. Desertion at this stage is no longer just a man wandered off. It becomes a breach of structured military integrity, which is a very elegant way of saying the same thing, just with more paperwork. Let's drift into a slightly more modern-feeling military setting now. Think 18th or 19th century. Large formations, standardized uniforms, orders shouted in ways that assume everyone is already standing exactly where they are supposed to be. And still, people leave, but the reasons begin to look a little different. Meet someone here. We'll call him Samuel. Samuel is part of a disciplined army, or at least, that's the official description. In reality, discipline is something that exists in theory and in carefully written regulations, and somewhat less consistently in daily life. Samuel joined with expectations that are, like most expectations in history, not fully aligned with reality. He expected structure. He got repetition. He expected purpose. He got marching. A lot of marching. And in between marching, waiting. Waiting is important here. Not dramatic waiting. Not cinematic anticipation. Just long stretches of time where nothing happens, except time itself continuing to pass. And in that space, thoughts begin to form. Small ones at first. This is tiring. Then slightly larger ones. I could be elsewhere. Then the ones that matter. I could leave. Now at this point in history, leaving is harder than it used to be. Armies are better organized. They track their men. They assign roles, units, identifiers. You are not just a soldier. You are part of a structure that notices when pieces are missing. So Samuel doesn't just walk away. He plans, carefully, not because he is especially clever, but because the system forces anyone attempting to leave to become at least a little strategic. He observes routines. He notices which officers are strict and which are tired. He watches supply movements, because supply routes are often less guarded. And he waits for a moment where attention is distributed unevenly, because that is when disappearance becomes possible. Now here is something interesting about desertion at this stage. It is no longer always impulsive. It becomes situational intelligence, a calculation, a quiet assessment of risk versus reward. Samuel is not thinking in terms of rebellion. He is thinking in terms of survival and preference. And that shift matters, because armies begin to understand something they had been reluctant to fully accept. Discipline alone does not guarantee retention. Conditions matter, treatment matters, pay matters, fatigue matters. And when those factors stack in the wrong direction, no amount of punishment solves the issue. But punishment still exists, and it is still designed to be discouraging. Not always cruel in the theatrical sense, but firm, because the goal is less about revenge and more about maintaining structure. Still, despite everything, Samuel makes his decision. One night, during a period of movement when the army is reorganizing camp positions, he steps away. Not dramatically. Not noticed. Just a shift in location that slowly becomes a permanent absence. Now whether he succeeds depends on geography, timing, and luck, because desertion is not just about leaving. It is about staying gone. Now let's gently zoom out, because Samuel is one example in a much larger system. Similar patterns repeat. When conditions are harsh, desertion increases. When pay is irregular, desertion increases. When leadership is poor, desertion increases. And commanders over time begin to develop what you might call a working tolerance for it. They assume some percentage of loss. Now let's shift slightly and talk about something that rarely gets emphasized: the emotional logic of desertion. Because not all deserters are making strategic calculations. Some are reacting to accumulated strain, not one event, but many small ones. The cold nights, the exhausting marchers, the fear before battles, the boredom between them, and the constant uncertainty of whether tomorrow will feel any different from today. Let's meet Elias. This Elias is thinking about distance. How far home feels. How long it has been since life felt normal. At some point, the army becomes more like a permanent environment. And that realization is dangerous. Because once something feels permanent, the idea of leaving it becomes more concrete. Elias does not decide in a single moment. It accumulates. Until one day, he simply does not return to his assigned place and becomes absent. Now the response to absence is where military systems reveal a lot about themselves. Because absence cannot be ignored. It must be categorized. Was he lost? Was he captured? Or did he leave? And if he left, what happens next depends on the structure of the army. In stricter systems, pursuit begins quickly. In looser systems, it becomes a matter of record. In either case, the individual becomes a case file. Now let's drift into something different. Not all desertion is permanent. Some soldiers return, voluntarily or otherwise. And in those cases, armies face another dilemma. What do you do with someone who left and came back? Punish them? Reintegrate them? If leaving is too easy, discipline weakens. If returning is impossible, manpower suffers. So systems balance between enforcement and practicality. Over centuries, desertion becomes less chaotic, less frequent in some cases, but never fully gone. It shifts form. It adapts. At some point, a soldier looks at the system they are part of and decides, I am no longer staying. And everything else flows from that. Desertion is a recurring human decision. One that appears whenever the cost of staying begins to outweigh the fear of leaving. No system built out of people can ever fully eliminate the possibility that those people might, one day, quietly decide to walk away. And sometimes, crossing those limits does not look like rebellion. It just looks like someone not showing up anymore. By the time we reach the final stretch of this long wandering history of desertion, the idea of a soldier simply walking away starts to feel less like a scandal and more like a recurring weather pattern. Something that just happens. Sometimes quietly, sometimes suddenly, but always somewhere in the background of every army that ever existed. And at this point in history, armies have become very good at two things: organizing men and losing men. Sometimes at the same time. Now let's drift into a slightly later era, where military systems are even more structured, more bureaucratic, more obsessed with records than ever before. Names are no longer just names. They are entries in registers, numbers in columns, parts of inventories that get updated with surprising emotional neutrality. And yet, desertion continues. Because structure does not erase exhaustion, and paperwork does not replace will. Let's settle into one final soldier's experience. We'll call him Henry again, just for continuity, though this is a different Henry than earlier. Henry serves in a large, organized military machine. Everything about his environment is regulated: when he eats, when he sleeps, when he marches, when he stops marching only to immediately start marching again. There is a rhythm to it, a very predictable one. And predictability, over time, starts to feel less like stability and more like confinement. Henry does not start with rebellion. He starts with observation. He notices how days repeat, how orders feel similar even when they are different, how the landscape changes, but his role in it does not. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he begins to imagine something outside of it. Not freedom in a dramatic sense. Just absence. A life where he is not constantly positioned, redirected, or accounted for. At first, this remains abstract. But armies, by their nature, eventually create conditions where abstraction becomes intention, because fatigue builds, and control becomes constant. And eventually, Henry reaches a point where staying feels heavier than leaving. Now, desertion at this stage is no longer a simple matter of stepping away. It is a considered action. There are consequences that are well understood. There are risks that are well documented. And yet, people still do it, because the alternative is continuing. And continuing for some is no longer acceptable. So Henry waits for movement, for distraction, for the exact kind of moment that armies, despite all their organization, cannot fully eliminate: human error. A gap in attention, a shift in routine. And when it arrives, he does not announce anything. He does not resist anything. He simply becomes absent from where he is supposed to be. Now, what follows is not dramatic. There is no immediate chase in every case, no sudden collapse of order. Instead, there is procedure, reports, confirmations, corrections to records. A quiet administrative realization that someone is no longer present. And this is where desertion becomes very modern in its structure, because it is no longer just about the act itself. It is about the system absorbing the absence, updating itself, adjusting, replacing where possible, continuing regardless. Now let's zoom out one last time. Across centuries, across empires, across different forms of military organization, the same pattern repeats. Armies try to reduce desertion through discipline, through punishment, through improved conditions, through incentives. And all of these help, to a degree. But none of them eliminate it entirely. Because desertion is not only a military problem, it is a human pressure valve. A point where individual endurance meets institutional expectation, and sometimes decides it cannot continue. And so soldiers leave, or disappear, or fail to return. And the system, in response, adapts. Always, sometimes slowly, sometimes brutally, sometimes efficiently. But always in response to the fact that it cannot fully prevent the possibility of departure. Now as we reach the end, something becomes clear. Desertion was never just about breaking rules. It was about limits. The limit of endurance. The limit of fear. The limit of meaning in a system that asks people to continue under conditions they may not choose. And every deserter represents a small interruption in the assumption that systems are stronger than individuals. Because sometimes they are, and sometimes they are not. So in the end, desertion does not feel like a dramatic historical rupture. It feels more like a quiet correction. A reminder that even the most organized structures in history are still built out of people who can decide they are done participating. And that is the story of soldiers who left. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as individuals reaching the edge and stepping away. And with that, the story gently settles, understanding that the line between duty and departure has always been thinner than armies would admit. And sometimes, it only takes one quiet decision to cross it.